Hello and welcome to the Parish Church of Crathie. This is the photograph of the interior of the church, and I was preaching and leading the services there last Sunday. And what I share now is taken from that service, but I wasn't able to record live because actually unexpectedly the King turned up. So I had to welcome the King at the door, King Charles, and he put me at ease very easily, and we had a brief chat before we started the service. So during the service, what I did is I set the scene for what I wanted to share later by telling a couple of stories from my experience as a medical doctor in the south of Thailand back in the 1980s. And so one day, an elderly Chinese gentleman, probably in his early 80s even, came in with a very ill, with a high temperature and a very tender mass or lump on the right iliac fossa or the right lower abdomen where the appendix is. I assumed it was an appendix abscess, so I anaesthetized him to drain it. I couldn't remove it, obviously, and then I discovered that instead of it being an appendix abscess, it was actually a very large gallbladder, normally stuck underneath the rib cage on the right hand side. Upper abdomen is extended right down into the lower abdomen, was full of pus and stones. I removed everything, drained it, sewed him up. He was on a drip. I thought, well, I've done the best I can. And over the next few days, he got worse and worse. And his granddaughter, who was a Christian, just become a Christian and joined our little Christian community there. And she pleaded with me to pray for him, pray for his healing. And I, with very little faith whatsoever, did so at his bedside. And she'd also been to see my wife, Carol, and my wife and the granddaughter, and I think several others were praying too, unbeknown to me. So the evening ward round before I went up to bed, suddenly something popped into my mind about a particular thing that I might be able to do to help him. It was an obscure piece of information from my medical training, which I injected him with glucose and insulin. That's to correct some ketosis, or yeah. Anyway, I won't go into the medical details, but anyway, I didn't expect him to survive the night, and when I got there in the morning, he was sitting up in bed eating rice porridge, and he made a full recovery and lived a number of years after that as well. So that was, if you like, a success story, a story of healing, a cure, and maybe some healing as well, as I shall explain later. The other, however, was the most devastating thing that happened to me as a medical person. A young man, well, he probably early 40s, with a small family and wife, had a motor traffic accident riding a motorcycle without a helmet. And he'd fractured his maxillary bone, which is up here, and he'd fractured it right at the back. And he was bleeding from his nose very severely from an artery, as it turned out. And so the more I packed the nose, the more the bleeding increased, until I eventually managed to use a particular technique with a rubber tube, Foley tube, which I won't go into explain, but it did manage to stop the bleeding. And I then packed his nose as well and told him, please do not unpick that pack out or touch it, just leave it alone until there's been sufficient healing for me to take it out. And unfortunately, he did. He couldn't resist picking at it, and the floodgates opened. His arterial bleeding from the nose started, and I knew there was no way I could stop it. We didn't have a blood bank, so we had to go in and operate. And this was in the evening, night time, I can't remember what time, but myself and one other colleague had to do the operation. We had an anaesthetic nurse helping us, as well as a sort of sister that looked after the sort of surgical side. And everything went fine eventually. It took us some time, but when we'd finished the operation, which had to be under general anaesthetic, remember, rather than normally, which we did everything under local or spinal or whatever, unfortunately there was a blood clot which the anaesthetic nurse hadn't noticed was sitting at the very bottom of his throat. And so when she pulled a tube out that had been feeding the gases and oxygen for him to breathe, the blood clot went into his lungs and into his bronchial tree, and it blocked, and he died on the table. So I was totally shattered and absolutely devastated by this. And so that was about 6 o'clock in the morning. Now, we didn't have phone contact with the UK at that time, so we had to send letters backwards and forwards to parents and family. And 2 weeks later, we received a letter from my mother-in-law saying, on such and such a date at such and such a time, it was near midnight, I think, she had received a phone call, and she heard my voice. She lifted the phone by the bed and heard my voice saying, "Please pray for me." So she woke my father-in-law up, and they prayed for not knowing what it was. They just simply prayed for me. And when I checked the date and time, I realized it was exactly the same time as I was walking up from the hospital after that terrible incident and feeling devastated. So in a way, that was a sort of different kind of healing. It was healing for me, and it helped me enormously. So without further ado, I'm going to go on now to share the readings with you. I'm going to just be reading the Gospel story, which is from Mark 5:21 to 43, and this is from the New Living Translation. Jesus got into the boat again and went back to the other side of the lake, where a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. Then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him. "My little daughter is dying," he said. "Please come and lay your hands on her and heal her so that she can live." Jesus went with him, and all the people followed, crowding around him. A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with a constant bleeding. She had suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years she had spent everything she had to pay them. But she had gotten no better. In fact, she had gotten worse. She had heard about Jesus, so came up behind him through the crowd and touched his robe. For she thought to herself, "If I can just touch his robe, I'll be healed." Immediately the bleeding stopped, and she could feel in her body that she had been healed of her terrible condition. Jesus realized at once that healing power had gone out from him, so he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my robe?" His disciples said to him, "Look at this crowd pressing around you. How could you ask who touched me?" But he kept on looking around to see who had done it. And then the frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what had happened to her, came and fell to her knees in front of him and told him what she had done. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over." While he was still speaking to her, the messengers arrived from the home of Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, and they told him, "Your daughter is dead. There's no use in troubling the teacher now." But Jesus overheard them and said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid, just have faith." Then Jesus stopped the crowd and wouldn't let anyone go with him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw how much commotion and weeping and wailing there was. He went inside and asked, "Why all this commotion and weeping? The child isn't dead, she's only asleep." The crowd laughed at him, but he made them all leave, and he took the girl's father and mother and his 3 disciples into the room where the girl was lying. And holding her hand, he said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And the girl, who was 12 years old, immediately stood up and walked around. They were overwhelmed and totally amazed. Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell anyone what had happened, and then he told them to give her something to eat. Before we begin our imaginative contemplation of this story, I'd invite you to simply pause for a moment and be still, to breathe slowly, and to recenter your scattered thoughts and senses and become present to yourselves, to the fact that you're here in this moment listening to this, and to the unseen presence of the risen Christ. in whose name we gather. I think it may be better if you close your eyes to allow your imagination to come more alive. I invite you to imagine that you are the father or maybe mother of the 12-year-old girl in the gospel story. She's so sick that unless she receives some urgent healing, she may die. Well, how might you be feeling? See if you can get in touch with that feeling. Have you ever felt that way? Perhaps when a loved one, be it a husband, wife, sister, brother, partner, or child, is suddenly struck down with an illness or has been seriously injured in an accident. Naturally today our first reaction is to call the ambulance or to take her to the A&E at our nearest hospital. But for Jairus and for many in this world today, they do not have the luxury of a national health service. Having heard that Jesus, the healer, is near, his first reaction is to call on him for help. Now, in such a situation, even though we are able to phone for medical help, we may also have prayed. Whether you actually have any particular faith or believe in God or not, it's not a question of either one or the other, but both the help available to us through modern medicine and what is often called alternative medicine, which includes prayer. And recent studies have shown that prayer helps people heal. Given his reputation as a healer, it's hardly surprising that Jesus always seemed to attract a crowd. So see if you can capture in your imagination yourself with Jesus, surrounded by people all seeking to get close to him, and you in that crowd. So progress towards your home is very slow. And as the parent of the sick child, how might you be feeling? Frustrated? Impatient? Annoyed? It's a bit like the ambulance being stuck in a traffic jam on a narrow street. And then to cap it all, Jesus stops and turns around to speak with a woman. Now, being in a village or small town community and seeing that you are the leading elder of the kirk or church, or which is the equivalent of what he was, you know that this woman hasn't been in church for years. And why? Well, she's ritually impure. According to the purity rules of your religion, she's not allowed to attend. She's excluded. Now, thankfully, we don't have that kind of rule in the church today. Nevertheless, there are many who exclude themselves from the faith community because they feel they are in some way or other impure. Now, it may be because they know how those in the church feel about the kind of person they are. Maybe they are gay or transsexual or simply feel that they are not good enough. Maybe it's because they do not or can't believe in God in the way that the church expects them to believe. And even though you are here, there may be times when you feel like that too. Whatever it is, they and you and I need healing as much as this woman needed it. So now let's imagine that you are that woman, feeling impure, feeling excluded, and you've been feeling that way for many years. 12 to be precise. In fact, your conditions started the very year that Jairus' daughter had been born. So here we are. We have two desperate people, Jairus and this unnamed woman, both in need of a healing miracle. One the equivalent of the Kirk minister, and the other an outsider, a woman, one bold and the other timid. But in her desperation for a cure, she squeezes through the crowd to be as close as she can to Jesus, believing that if she was just close enough to touch his clothes, some kind of magical power might just do the trick. And as soon as she touched his garment, she felt something happen in her body. She knew she had been cured. How would you feel? Imagine. What would you do? And maybe you too don't want to draw attention to yourself. Maybe you too would rather just quietly slip away, unnoticed, satisfied in the knowledge that your embarrassing condition had been cured. But it wasn't just this woman who felt something the moment she touched Jesus' garment. Jesus himself felt power go out of his body. Now that might be hard for us to imagine, because we've lost the ability to sense the more subtle energies of our bodies. No one has just a physical body. We also have subtle bodies, energy bodies, but most of us are not attuned to sense these higher energies. However, there are many in the world, even today, who are gifted with that ability and discover that they too have healing powers. And though you do have to know how to use this wisely for the good of those you are helping, and not just for personal gain. And if you would like to find out more about this, I recommend Dr. Lisa Rankin's book, Sacred Medicine, and I'll put a note in the description of this video. It's clear in the original language of the Gospel that the woman in our story hoped for a cure for her bleeding condition, and often when people pray for healing, that's all they wish for, a cure. There's a specific word that's used in the Greek passage, meaning cure, not healing. But Jesus wants far more for us than just a cure for our physical ailments. He wants us to be healed. Different word. So real healing results in us being able to flourish and thrive and live with the ease of well-being in right relationship with ourselves, others, and the universe in which we live. So listen to these words, spoken as much to us as to the woman in this story. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. Your suffering is over. And the peace he gives us is a word that also means wholeness, shalom. The suffering that was healed was not just the discomfort and inconvenience of the disease, but the stigma of being unclean, being unacceptable to God, being a bit of an outcast in society. Sometimes when we pray for healing, what happens is not a cure, but a healing. And that too is part of the mystery of healing. Now see if you can put yourself in Jairus' shoes again. How might you be feeling at what must have been quite a long delay caused by this woman? But Jesus was helping him and us to learn some important lessons in life. We may feel frustrated by the many interruptions we have whilst we are doing something that is vitally important. Now, the deeply spiritual theologian and writer Henri Nouwen once said, "You know, my whole life I've been complaining that my work was constantly interrupted, until I discovered that my interruptions were my work." So let's go back to being Jairus in our imagination. Whilst you've been anxiously waiting for Jesus to finish talking with this woman, messengers arrive from your home, and they inform you that sadly it's too late. Your daughter has died. And they suggest there would be no point in troubling the teacher anymore. Well, now how do you feel? Your worst fears have been realized. And then you hear Jesus speaking to you. Don't be afraid, trust me. Trust in God. Hear these words as if they are spoken to you, spoken to each and every one of us, each in our different circumstances. Then Jesus stops the crowd and doesn't let anyone go with him except his closest apprentices, Peter, John, and James, John's brother. And as you approach your home, you hear the sound of weeping and wailing, a sure sign that in that culture that someone had died. We tend not to do that in the Scottish culture or even in the British culture. We bottle it up. But what Jesus wants is not for us to bottle our feelings up, but to have faith. Weeping when you have faith is quite different from what people in the Middle Eastern cultures do, and indeed in the Thai culture that I am familiar with. The common commotion that creates an atmosphere in which it's very difficult for any healing energy to flow. So on entering the house, Jesus asked them, "Why all this commotion and weeping?" and asserts that despite appearances, the child isn't dead, she's only asleep. Well, those gathered there just laughed at him. Well, how might you have reacted if you had been one of the family and friends gathered there? Well, leaving the mocking mourners outside, Jesus takes you, along with his 3 apprentices, into the room where the dead child is lying. And taking her hand, he says to her, "Talitha cum," meaning, "Little girl, get up." Or, "My child, get up." Now imagine that you are that child, and you've just woken up from a wonderful experience. What was it like to be asleep? Your body has stopped breathing, your heart has stopped beating, and yet you are feeling more alive than ever. What you are experiencing is more real than any dream you've ever had. And if you've never had a near-death experience yourself, it may be difficult to imagine what that is like. But I know, and I know of others who have who've had that kind of experience. In fact, one Thai person I know died having had a very severe reaction to penicillin. It was an anaphylactic shock. He saw himself rise out of his body and was able to observe all that was going on in the emergency room. I think this was in Hawaii, where he was on business. But then he travelled through a dark tunnel into a space filled with glorious light, and there he met what he now realizes was the risen Christ. And for the first time in his life, he felt such a strong sense of being loved just for who he was. But he was sent back with a mission to tell others. And when he woke up in his body with a medical resuscitation team all around him, it was just an experience that changed his life. But there are more ways in which we die than merely the death of our physical body. We can feel emotionally dead, spiritually dead. So this story speaks to us no matter what our particular needs are. So hear these words. Not "little girl, arise," but imagine Jesus saying to you right now, Ken, Mary, Brian, Beth, or whatever your name is, arise to real life. Not the life of the living dead, but the life of the real live person, the person you really are, if only you knew it. Amen. And I'm going to conclude this video by sharing a very brief prayer which I included in the prayers that followed towards the end of the service. Spirit of the risen Christ, the living God, present with us now, enter you, body, mind, and spirit, and heal you of all that harms you.